Hi, my name is Peter Pilgrim and welcome to BOF 17, another video presentation. Mike Burton presents an introduction to JavaServer Faces. We had a problem with the OHP projector, so that means that the lighting is not as good as what we'd like. As an added bonus, Duncan Mills is demonstrating at the end of this video some fabulous Ajax support in Oracle's new ADF Faces. Enjoy this one especially from me.
We've got 10 minutes.
Right, good evening guys. For those of you who didn't chat to earlier, I'm Mike Burton and nice to be here to speak to you this evening. Brief talk about JSF, just to give you an introduction to it really. I could possibly do a demo, but you know that's for later I think. 10 minutes is all we got. My background, I've been doing Java for the last 5 years, Java development. Prior to that, about 10-15 years of C++, and prior to that, you're not really interested in. It's all the steam-driven Stone Age stuff. Web applications I've been doing for about the last couple of years, using the Java type technologies and also a bit of PHP and Perl, those sort of things. Came across JSF. I basically had a project to do. I work for myself. Had done contracting, but I tend now to do projects and consultancy. And the current project that came along needed this sort of thing. So I thought, well, let's review where the state of the art is with Java-based web application frameworks. Looked around. A few of you seem to know struts. So JSF, from what I can see, really seems to build on struts. It's got some things better, some things not so. I think there are things that struts perhaps does better. Anyway, this is to just say what I like about JSF really. Click manually because stuffing seems to have stopped working. Key features of JSF then. Uses a model view controller pattern, much like you used to with struts. I'm going to go through each of these things in a bit more detail later on, but this is just the summary for them. A big thing here, render kits, hence the word faces. And this is just a layer that's put on the front to render your application. So if you want it to run on a web page, you have one set of renderers. If you want it to run on WML for a mobile phone, or Telnet, or whatever, so you can have it running any different face bolted onto the front of the application. It's component event based. That's I think that's quite different from struts, and that's the thing I happen to like for writing sort of business applications. Yay. You've got, rather than having, it's basically it combines your action form with your action into a backing bean, a little bit like what we're looking at with web work, I think. So you have one class behind the scenes. Backing bean is an object, an instance of that class, and that's basically attached to your JSP page. And inside, on your JSP page, you've got edit fields and list boxes and whatever you like. Mapped, associated with those are members inside of your backing bean class, which is a Java bean. And then when you press buttons on that page or links or whatever, they cause methods to run that are inside of that backing bean class. You can have data inside your backing bean, so you're not limited to sort of calling your DAO. You can hold state in that bean as well. The bean can decide. You can decide what scope it is. Is it application scope? In other words, that's global for everybody to share. Is it session scope for the entire session of that user? Is it just request scope, or is it completely global, like a static variable? So you've got all those choices. CSS, cascading style sheets for your formatting, I found to be very nice. It does have validation. I'm not quite sure about the standard validation that comes with JSF, but it's fairly easy to write your own validators. For instance, the standard string validator is required to say, you must put this in. if you put in a blank space, it seems to allow it. So yeah, you tend to be writing your own, but which is easy enough to do. Page flow, it's very, very good on. Found complex web applications where you go from one page to another, depending on which action you do. So you've got a nice piece of XML that basically lists all of your navigation actions and then outcomes from each of those. So like when we're on this page, if we do this, go to here. If we do this, go to there. And all of these things are navigation outcomes, which you can then map to a JSP page. Behind the scenes, when a method wants to decide where to return, a bit like with structs, you would return a forward action. You simply return a string, which gets mapped to within the navigation section of faces.xml, which is your navigation definitions. Pluggable, yeah, so everything's, you kind of write it once, bolt it in wherever you need it really. It's standard, I'm not quite sure how much that means to people. There seem to be a lot of really good frameworks that people have written that are not so kind of mainstream, but this is basically the thing pushed by Sun and others at the moment. So being mainstream, maybe it's not so leading edge, not so good as some things, but stability and consistency, I chose, it's a mainstream thing that's going to be developed and around for a while. A few of those points in detail now. Don't know how much, I guess you guys all know this anyway, I'm preaching to the converted here. Benefits of the model view controller pattern. Separating your application into layers. So, your presentation layer, your business logic and your data access, keep them in separate layers. JSF promotes that. Somebody said before, nothing new under the sun. So this is just what engineering has been doing for ages. Your car isn't all one big hairball model, it's separated in engine and instruments and controls. So MVC is just the same idea as that really. JSP servlet type applications where you're allowed to have mixtures of code and markup on a page really lead to a kind of merging of these layers, these spheres of concern, if you like. So it's good to separate those out. So JSF and struts, etc. You have markup with tags. So you've got tags like we were looking at with web work, and that relates to methods inside of your separate Java. Backing beans. Why is it called Faces? As I mentioned before here, you can have a pluggable interface to render it, called a render kit, for whatever client you like. Similar point to that was, I said, component event-based. Bit of history from my sort of model track record. As it happens, I discovered when I was putting together this talk that every 4 years I seem to discover a new kind of event-driven, component-based development model. So not very proud of some of the earlier ones, but they work and they were around at the time. And they, for knocking simple systems together. I got the same sort of buzz about JSF when I came across it, looked into it, as I did with Delphi and Swing. So it's quite Swing-like really in what you can do, your events and such like. Cascading style sheets I find are good. The presentation side, I'm not an artist, I'm basically a coder, and so I can throw things together with the styles I think are okay, and then an artist can come along and just change the CSS, and it all looks nice.
Or totally mess it up.
Well, yeah, depending on who it is, yeah. So, yeah.
Job's not doing part of it.
Yeah. No offence, you know the three characters. I suppose I'm a pointy hat, though I'm wearing a suit today because I've been talking to clients. But, yeah. So, my wife's the artist, she kind of puts the style and things for me. Validation. One thing I liked about how JSF works is you can put a validation message for the whole form, like at the top, you've done something wrong, you need to do this. So if it's the two of the fields on this particular application mustn't both be 0. Alternatively, you can put extra an input field, you can put a message. So messages can be related to a particular field or the form as a whole. You can have it generate JavaScript for you as well, and even have it generate Ajax type, interface with Ajax, so that you can have very, very interactive, and when you tab off of this, do some validation on it. That sort of thing can be done. Okay. The navigation side of things, JSF separates basically the rules from the actual decisions of where you're navigating. So you have a set of navigation rules which says from this view, a view is basically a JSP file, and there are a number of navigation cases for that view. This one here I've only got one as it happens. So I'm saying if the outcome from this page is no way, okay, it's a validation page where you're checking somebody's credit limit or something like that, then we go back to the main menu basically, or back to log on. Likewise, you can have several different outcomes, everything defined in this XML structure in your main file, which is faces.xml. Okay. The decisions are made. Here's an action method, or an event, if you like, event handler. So in response to a button being pressed, this bit of code gets run in the backing bean, the Java class that's sitting behind our particular page. And I'm just saying, if the initial is Z, return no way, etc. So the stuff you return from your action methods is simply related back to these outcomes. So because we're on this page at the moment and we've returned no way from a method of the bean for that page, then that takes us into the navigation rules for that page, and it looks up the particular outcome that we've just returned for, and that will then cause us to go off to whatever other page we like to do. For data entry, it's success, what do you do? Return them back to the OK page or whatever, or present the data they've just entered. You don't need to do that. If you return null, you just stay on the same page. So it's good for having event-driven type programming where you've got a page with buttons on it that do something, and then stay on that page. So it seems to work very well in that way. Okay. Another good thing about it, actually, I may have mentioned earlier on, it's been designed to fit in with IDEs nicely. So the IDE makers can easily make sense of this lot and build you little diagrams and the like. So, for instance, I've been using BEA Workshop, which seemed to be quite a good tool that I found at the time, and that's an Eclipse plugin. So that gives you a little diagram of your navigation rules, similar to what you could see from here. So from this page, you've got different actions that are going to get returned, and those result in taking you to various different pages. You can have global navigation rules as well. So from anywhere, Ajax renderer, that will produce the necessary Ajax or JavaScript or whatever code.
So on just changing the renderer, I can switch on between whether it's Ajax enabled or normal ones.
It's more, to be Ajax enabled, you need a component that is aware of those events as well. So from the JSF programmer's point of view, they've just got more events they can react to. So, I have not only got a value change event, I've also got a key pressed event, for instance. Not a JavaScript key pressed event, but on the server I get a key pressed event. The actual implementation as to how that event gets sent from the client UI back to the middle tier is immaterial as far as the component consumer is concerned. So it does make it very easy to produce very rich components which you can program to and adapt to very easily. So that's why it's such a nice model, because you don't have to learn new stuff in order to start using Ajax components.
What are the default renderers that come with this? Because I've started using a bit of SVG, can't really work. Does it have an SVG renderer?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I've only really used the HTML.
The Sun reference implementation only comes with HTML.
Right.
The ADF Faces component set, which is now part of Apache MyFaces, has Telnet adapters, obviously phone adapters, mobile adapters, and HTML. There are people doing SVG. There are people doing Zool. There are people looking at doing Swing as render technologies.
The way it's been,
Just telling you the goods.
the way it's been built, I mean, it's easy to develop those.
So certainly SVG has been done, and within Oracle we're using SVG for some of the graphical JSF components, because obviously for doing charting and stuff, it's an ideal technology, so we can use an SVG renderer for that. The barrier to SVG is more what the browsers support natively than anything else. So yeah, that's good.
Okay. This is my last slide. The open source challenge. These are some sort of tricks, things I tripped up on along the way with, really, that might benefit other people. Being open source, there's always new releases of things coming along, and you're using different components. For the data, I happen to use Hibernate, and so there's different versions of Hibernate, different versions of. I use Tomcat as the application server. So which version do you use? Which one is stable? Which works well? Which works with all the others? Oh, that's got a new feature that's just been brought out yesterday. Let's upgrade that component. So it's very, do you know what I mean? It's difficult to get a baseline and keep something stable. And that was one of the worst challenges that I had. I had to go back to version 2 of Hibernate, for instance, although version 3 has some really nice features in it. I can't remember for why, but you basically don't change too many things at once, otherwise everything falls apart and you spend another few days putting everything back together again. That's one of the natures. Finding the right software in the first place. I mean, I'm sure there are alternatives that I could have used that would be as good or better, you know, different frameworks, different presentation template things, what have you. So that was the... I think the way how I found these, actually, I did look at the Oracle tool set. I looked at what was the BEA, which was known as Nitrox at the time. Basically looked at what those people were supporting, and Hibernate seemed to be a good thing to go with. JSF reports was quite a common one for reporting. Those things kind of integrate nicely together, so you know if an IDE vendor has, you know, is working with those things, then those are good things worth looking at. Most of it's open source, so Eclipse, Tomcat, and all that good stuff that I'm sure you know about, Hibernate, JSF reports, etc. All for free. The only things I actually paid for were my IDE. I went a bit over the top with this one and got the full version with the data handling in it. It has what they call ORM, Workbench Object Relational Mapping. Okay, so
what IDE was this? Workshop?
This is BEA Workshop.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was it worth it? I mean, it's quite a lot of money, 600.
Yeah, I think for 300 I could have had the one without the object relational mapping, which is basically doesn't give you much more than what you get with Hibernate.
Did you use MyEclipse, or did you consider that? Or
I looked at that, yeah.
Okay, so you looked at Genutech and stuff, and I mean the other one, the Nitro, of course, and you decided to go with Nitro.
Yeah.
Instead of MyEclipse. That's interesting. But did you look at before at XVII?
I did, yes. Yeah, I looked at them.
Okay.
Yeah. Can't remember why I chose in favour of these and over them.
Okay.
That was one of the problems, really. There's so much to look at.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could spend months really looking at everything, and by the time it's like painting the fourth bridge, isn't it? You know, you've looked at everything, and suddenly something else came along during that month.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of draw a line and say, right, I think I've got something that'll go. Let's go with it.
Can you explain how does the testing work within JSF? Because one of the things that Peter didn't mention with WebWork is that each action is a POJO, so it's really easy to test.
Yeah.
Is
Did
that
I not
safe?
mention that? I didn't mention it.
Right.
Yeah.
This, if you keep your layers separate, it's it's easy to test. So I ended up using DAOs for doing most of the work with the database, and those are just POJOs. So test those either in JUnit or just with a simple main method in the DAO class. As for testing the graphical, the JSF stuff, you can't really test that in isolation, that business logic, if you like, the backing beam. So that really has to be tested with the JSF, I found.
Well, it depends. I mean, the managed beams or backing beams themselves are POJOs, so they can be tested provided you can freak up whatever inputs now. Which
Yeah.
I mean, it's
In
a standard
practice-
problem of they're part of a much bigger whole. But certainly if you've got, which you shouldn't, but if you had dependencies, say you were reading directly from the session or something, it'll be hard to test. But if you do JSF properly, then you always inject resources anyway into those managed beams, so that's a lot easier to test harness based on. So
You
it is
can't
tricky.
really, in theory, but in practice you end up with, in your test harness, you need, for certain things, you're going to end up needing a faces context, for instance.
Yeah.
And how do you knock one of those up that reliably mimics the real one? For that, basically, to get around that, I piloted on a small page that didn't do any data handling, and those run quite quickly, so that was quite a good way to test. And within Eclipse, you can set breakpoints and look at the code and so on. BEA Workshop lets you look at the JSP variables as well as just the actual Java, so you can step through any JSP as well as the Java code.